The world's largest two empires are on divergent paths, and Africa has a relationship with both. The way Africa chooses to proceed with these relationships are going to either make or break the continent of Africa, allowing it to either meet its full potential or stay victim to the rest of the world, taking everything it wants from the continent of Africa with very little in return. In this video, I'm going to talk about one of the key differences that has happened just this week, a difference that could open up a new level of prosperity for the everyday man on the continent of Africa. If you're interested in understanding the geopolitical changes that can make or break the continent of Africa, you're in the right place. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is TJ, I'm Nigerian and British mixed, and on this channel, we talk about African geopolitics. So I don't think anyone would argue with me that it doesn't matter who you are, empires rise and fall. The Egyptian Empire, a great and incredible empire that we don't even understand their technology, came and went. The Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Mongol Empire, the Aztec Empire, all amazing empires of their time, all of whom rose to an amazing level and fell. If you watch this channel, you'll know that it is my belief that the Western Empire, led by the United States, is on the decline and is following the same pattern of all empires. At the same time, a new empire, China, is on the rise. Now, does it mean that this empire is going to fall tomorrow? No. Does it mean that the Chinese empire is going to dominate tomorrow? No. What it means is that there is a potential for a switch from the world focusing on everything that America does, from America's influence, from the United States dollar dominating everything across the globe, to a more multipolar centric world where the global south, led by China, Russia, and India, are going to be the dominant powers of the world. Africa is key to this empire shift because Africa controls a massive amount of the raw minerals and resources that the world needs. The problem is, of course, and some of the inspiration for me doing this channel is the fact that the African people are not enjoying the fruits of the things that come out of the continent. There is still widespread poverty. There is still people living without dignity. There are still people suffering in large quantity across the continent, living a standard much lower to the rest of the world. And I, for one, want to see this change. You see, Africa has great potential, incredible potential. You only have to look at the diaspora and how they perform outside the continent of Africa to know we have great minds. You only have to look at some of the signs now we're seeing in places like Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa, that let you know the potential of the continent of Africa in pockets here and there. But those positive signs are not enough because we do not see the majority of people enjoying this increase. So I believe it is a good thing to stay abreast of how these empires shift so that we can know, as the continent of Africa, how to act, how to position ourselves, whether to maintain our trade relationships, change them, or evolve, how to understand our positioning as countries trade. And of course, this is key because of all the minerals that we have on the continent. So this week, the United States have done something that has massively shifted the way the everyday consumer in the United States buys small goods under $800 from foreign imports. And this is going to have a substantial effect on the American economy and on the global economy itself. How US shoppers will be hit as the Minimis tariff exemption ends. The US has pulled the plug on a long-running global tariff exemption that has been widely used by buyers at low-cost goods. From Friday, imports valued at $800 or less will no longer be duty-free and will face tighter customs checks in the move that's set to affect millions of shipments a day. Last year, almost 1.4 billion packages worth a total of more than $64 billion entered America without being charged duties under a rule called the de minimis exemption, according to the US Customs. This is the thing that allows the Americans to buy things from China, drop shipping, Temu, Shein, all those things. Experts say US President Donald Trump's policy change will hit small businesses hardest, and shoppers should brace for higher prices and fewer options, at least until the dust settles. I've reached a point of acceptance, but when I first heard the news about 2.5-3 weeks ago, I felt like it might be the end of my business, said Catherine Faye Bowles, founder and creative director of Buenos Aires-based shoe brand Zhao Zhu. It still might. That remains to be seen. So the article talks a little bit more about what de minimis rule is. And so I'm going to jump down to this area called prices to rise. Without the exemption, businesses will have to factor in tariffs the US has imposed on the country of origin, which came into effect for most nations in August. Those levies can be as low as 10% for countries like the UK and Australia, while goods from Brazil and India face the highest tariffs of 50%. Obviously, this is Donald Trump's war on BRICS nations and the global south as they trade amongst each other without the US dollar. He's put massive tariff increases on these countries. Following the change, specific duties will be imposed of $80 per item for countries with tariffs of 16% or less, and $160 for shipments for countries between 16 and 25% tariffs, or $200 for items from countries with higher tariffs. Can you imagine? There are items that people buy for $10, $20 that they are happy to wait a few weeks to arrive from China for, that now will be subject to a potential $80 increase or even a $160 increase if it comes from India or Brazil. Now, what you must realize is that it's the person buying the product on ground will be the one spending the extra money, which means it's essentially a tax on the US citizens. This is a squeeze on their own economy, and they think that it's going to make other countries pay.
Donald Trump has claimed that tariffs would bring in significant tax revenue, that tax revenue would come from abroad, and that they would repatriate production, particularly in manufacturing, to the United States. That's impossible across the board. First of all, foreigners do not pay the tariffs. Tariffs are import taxes paid by the importer. One can argue that, well, in fact, the exporters pay the tariffs because they lower their prices by the amount of the tariff. That would presume that the U.S. importer is what's called a monopsonist, a company that has enormous buying power. And if the importer is a monopsonist, you don't need tariffs to beat down prices. In other words, if a monopsonist can say, there's been a 10% tariff, we demand that you lower your price by 10%, they don't need to wait for the tariffs. They would say it now, lower your price by 10% or else. Second, it can either bring in significant revenue or protect U.S. manufacturing. It can't do both. If it brings in significant revenue, it's because we continue to import goods from abroad. That's where the tariff revenue comes from. If it does protect U.S. manufacturing, we don't get revenue from abroad because we stop importing. So it can't do all those things that Donald Trump claims.
It's unlikely that local manufacturers will be able to fill the gap for all of the products and supply chain, including raw materials, by the way, that come from everywhere else in the world, so that you can have products in the United States that are finished and usable. Chinese companies like Shein and Temu have set up distribution centers in the US that will help ease some of the cost of tariffs, said Ms. Nguyen. And China is months ahead in figuring out the paperwork as compared to firms in other countries that are now scrambling to get up to speed. She added, there may be fewer competitors in the overall market, and the end of de minimis exemption makes it harder for small businesses to launch e-commerce sites, said Ms. Nguyen. So what this is allowing is for Chinese companies like Temu and Shein to create massive distribution centers because they have such a large scale of operation and sort of get around these taxes, still delivering products to the United States, which is essentially helping China. It's funding China. It's boosting the Chinese economy. And China is the direct competitor to the United States right now. I think this shows a contraction, a tightening, an almost emergency-like status that the United States is scrambling to put into place. As empires start to fail, they start to do more desperate measures, more contractive measures. These are measures that generally squeeze the population. They create more disgruntled individuals, and the people tend to prosper less. This then adds to the snowball effect of a negative sentiment towards the central government, and then you can end up with things like this contributing to things like civil war and other issues. So overall, what I'm trying to say is that this is a telltale sign that America is on the decline. It is a desperate measure to get back on track financially, but it's not likely going to work. In the meantime, what are we seeing from China? we're seeing the opposite posture, an opening, a spreading across the globe, a reducing of taxes. In fact, China-Africa trade surges as duty-free African products boost markets. So we have China essentially doing the exact opposite, giving Africa an opportunity to sell into its consumer base tariff-free. Now, if you were going to put a bet on two economies, one that is expanding, removing barriers for trade, versus one that is contracting, adding barriers for trade, which economy would you bet on? And this article here highlights how Africa is benefiting from this. We have to pay attention because of the potential that this means for the growth of the continent. China's Ministry of Commerce, MOFCOM, on Thursday highlighted the trend of deepening ties with China and Africa driven by booming trade. Since September 2024, noting that a large number of distinctive and high-quality African products have entered the Chinese market duty-free, enriching customer choices and boosting related industries in Africa. From January to July this year, China's imports from the largest developed countries, LDCs, in Africa reached 66.6 billion, a year-on-year increase of 10.2%, data related by MOFCOM showed. So, in comparison to America's imports, which in the previous article was 64 billion, which is now likely to massively shrink, we've got something like half of that, 39.66 billion, coming from the African continent alone going to China. That's not the world. That's just what's coming from Africa. This is when you start to put into perspective the change that is happening on the globe, what is going on, and how it relates to the continent of Africa. Products such as avocados from Kenya, Arabica coffee beans from Ethiopia, and cocoa beans from Cameroon have entered the Chinese market duty-free, providing Chinese consumers with more options and promoting the development of the related industries in Africa, spokesman He Hyong-Quin said. Markets are opening up for us. Southeast Asia, South America, China are all looking for ways to diversify away from the United States. This is a potential moment for the continent of Africa. Our leadership needs to take heed of this. Local business, medium business, large business on the continent need to take heed of this. Diaspora returning to the continent need to understand this trend. This is where wealth is found. This is how we uplift the everyday man in the communities all around the continent of Africa. This could be a baseline to increase our manufacturing capabilities and become to China what China is kind of to America, which is a supplier of products to their consumer market. You see, China consumer market is growing rapidly right now, and we can use that to grow ourselves. The global community is absolutely fed up with Donald Trump's tariffs. It's straining everybody. They're looking for alternatives. Now is the time. If Africa does not take advantage of this potential, it will never get anywhere. At the moment, Africa has a lot of potential, but potential still has to be realized. That means actions have to be taken in order to capture that potential. There's nothing worse than somebody that has great potential as a child, you understand this, and then you find out years later that they didn't reach that potential and they failed in life, perhaps going into drugs or becoming homeless, and you think, wow, that potential was wasted. That analogy applies here. And on this channel, we are here to spread that idea. I'm sure you guys have lots of thoughts about this. Please put them in the comment section. But if you have nothing to say, would it be too much for you to write the words Africa potential is now in the comment section? It just lets me know that you like the channel, you like what I'm doing, you watched the video to the end, and you want me to continue doing this. Thank you so much for watching the video today, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.